suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Kaka.
Mr. President,
Senator from Delaware.
are we in a quorum call?
Yes,
Mr. President, I ask the proceedings under the quorum call be vitiated.
without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak to the issues on the floor before the Senate, the vote we will take later today, on two competing plans for our path forward. Mr. President, as you and I and all the members of this chamber know, our national debt and our deficit are enormous. They're unsustainable. And last week, an array of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle came to the floor one after the other to make exactly that point. Members of both parties agree that excessive debt hurts our competitiveness, that it causes interest rates to rise and crowds out critical investments in our country's future. My own experience, Mr. President, in the private sector and 6 years of tough budget balancing as a county executive in my home state of Delaware taught me how important it is to have responsible budget processes in place, to manage your way through difficult financial times, to create opportunity for our communities while still reducing our deficits and debt. There is no question, Mr. President, that high debt levels lead to lower growth in the long run and can restrain or starve or strangle the dreams of our communities, our children, for our future. Our deficit and debt is a ticking time bomb, and one everyone, Republicans and Democrats, independents, economists, experts, working families, small business owners, the American people, know that we want to and we have to deal with it. But the key, Mr. President, in my view, is to deal with this problem responsibly and fairly and in a way that reflects America's values. Our debt is neither a Republican nor a Democratic problem, but a shared and structural problem. It took both parties to get us into this mess, and it will take both parties working together to dig us out. Each member of this body must take responsibility and look at what's best for the next generation, not just for winning the next election. For my part, I'm continue the fight for balanced and responsible deficit reduction. If the American people can share and sacrifice in our cities and counties and states all over this country, as they're already doing in my home state of Delaware, then Republicans and Democrats have to show that we too can come together and find a way to compromise. Mr. President, it's time we recognize a sobering reality that if we're going to plug the hole in our national balance sheets, if we're going to avoid the fate of Europe, and it is a really, really big hole in the bottom of America's balance sheet, while still continuing to invest in our future and in the strength and promise and opportunity of our communities, we have to find, I think, a more responsible, more fair balance between spending cuts and revenue increases. We simply cannot achieve the level of savings we need through spending cuts alone. Drastic cuts, dramatic cuts, across-the-board cuts violate our very values and will drive down the possibility of recovery and growth in the future. Spending cuts must be a central part of the solution to our budget problem, but the fact is revenue must also play a meaningful role. We need, Mr. President, balance. It's the only way to provide the economic certainty necessary to sustain a recovery, and in my view, the only way to sustain investments that are critical for our future. Let's be clear, Mr. President, about some rhetoric that we've heard both out in the country and here in this chamber. The United States doesn't begrudge success. We as Democrats, we in this chamber, don't resent those who have achieved, who've succeeded. In fact, that's the engine that for generations has drawn people from around the world to this country and has pulled people forward, the hopes and dreams of those who see reason to work in this country because of the promise of opportunity, the very real history of entrepreneurship, of risk-taking, and the very great rewards this country provides those who succeed beyond their wildest dreams through hard work, through innovation, through creativity. No, we don't resent or reject wealth and success in this chamber or in this country. In fact, we admire it, and we want to create the groundwork for a whole new generation of Americans to achieve the successes of the last generation. If we're going to do right by the next generation of Bill Gateses or Warren Buffetts, that requires us to find solutions that make our tax system fairer and prevent burdening the next generation of Americans with a crushing national debt. As President Lyndon Johnson said once, though, it's not just enough to open the gates of opportunity. All of our citizens have to have the ability to walk through those gates. The ability of future Americans to walk through those gates, Mr. President, I believe, requires sustainable investments in our future, in our schools and teachers, so our children can compete in the global economy and we can keep improving public education, in infrastructure, so our businesses can move their products and ideas as fast as our competitors can on our roads and rails and broadband, in research and development, so America can continue to be a world leader in innovation and scientific breakthroughs. Mr. President, we all know that health care costs are among the greatest drivers of our mounting national deficits and debt, and we've got two paths forward. One where we cut and constrain and reduce our spending, and another where we invest in basic science and research, where we innovate and where we cure our way out of these challenges. I think this latter way of investing in our schools, our infrastructure, our innovation, and in finding path-breaking cures is more true to the American spirit. Cuts, as you know, Mr. President, to essential services and programs are already deep. Although this isn't broadly known throughout the country, sacrifices have already been made here and pennies are already being pinched from programs that, in my view, serve the people who can least afford them. In my home state of Delaware, due to choices we've made here, we've already seen cuts to critical programs like heating assistance to low-income families, and programs like the Community Development Block Grants and home programs were cut roughly 30% in last year's budget. Programs that for so long have supported affordable housing for the disabled, for seniors, for the low income. We must continue to make cuts across the board to move our way towards a sustainable federal deficit, but, Mr. President, cuts alone cannot responsibly make our path forward. And we've seen proposals in the other chamber that would decimate vital safety net programs like Medicare and Medicaid, shifting the burden of deficit reduction to our most vulnerable citizens. We need to bring balance back to how we solve these problems, and we need to do it in a way that puts a circle of protection, Mr. President, around those who are most vulnerable in our society. In previous generations that served in this chamber, when they came together and reached the resolutions that solved our country's fiscal problems in 1983, for example, they put a circle of protection around the most vulnerable Americans. They chose not to slash or cut or eliminate those programs that are focused on the most vulnerable in our society, the disabled, low-income seniors, children in the earliest stages of life. And I think it's important that we remember those values as we look at the choices we make here today and as we come together in the months leading up to the election and hopefully after the election to craft a solution to our structural problems. Today on the floor, Mr. President, the Senate's considering the other piece of the equation from cuts, revenue. Mr. President, we have a stark choice between us today. We have two plans, a Reid plan and a Hatch plan. We have a Democrat proposal and a Republican proposal. And let me put this in some context that I think has been missing in some of the speeches I've heard on the floor here earlier today. In both cases, these are plans that make choices about which of our existing tax cuts, which of the existing tax expenditures we will allow to expire and which we will extend. There's a lot of talk about the coming tax-mageddon, about the greatest one-time tax increase in American history. But let's be clear. What we're talking about is tax cuts that were enacted in 2001 and 2003 and other tax cuts that were enacted in 2009 and 2010, and whether they should be extended or whether these temporary tax cuts should be allowed to be that and expire. We have two starkly different plans, Mr. President. In one, the Republican plan, They extend all of the Bush tax cuts, even for the highest income earners, even on the marginal rates of the highest income earners. And the Democrat plan extends and does not allow to expire critical tax cuts, the earned income tax credit, the tuition tax credit, and the child tax credit that 25 million Americans, the working poor, working families with children, rely on to get through this difficult recession. The Republican plan allows all three of those to expire, and thus, to use their language, raises taxes on 25 million of the working poor. It should be an obscenity, Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, for there to be people who are working full-time and yet poor in this country. This is the country, as I said before, of opportunity, the place to which millions have come over generations from around the world seeking the opportunity of this country. Yet today, and especially in this economy, working poor has real meaning. As the rate of poverty has raised to alarming levels, 1 in 6 Americans is poor today, the highest rate since the 1960s. The economic inequality and the lack of opportunity and justice for those who are the poorest is at an alarming rate. We also have, as I said before, Mr. President, a structural challenge before us, a deficit and debt we must deal with. And so the Democrat plan that is on the floor today, where we will take a vote later today, whether this body wants to proceed to take a deciding vote on it, would allow the marginal tax rates above $200,000 for individuals, $250,000 for couples, to return to the Clinton era. So let's be clear, because I think this is often lost. Under the Democrats' tax plan, we would continue tax breaks for all Americans who earn income, for all small businesses that are revenue earning, but just on the first $200,000 individual income or $250,000 couple income. So even the millionaires and billionaires would continue to get some of the benefit of the tax breaks first enacted in 2001 and 2003. What would be raised is the tax rate on income above $250,000 for couples. So everyone continues to get some tax advantage. But the excessive, the highest reductions in tax burden on the very wealthiest Americans, we would allow to expire. What's the impact on our deficit and debt? $850 billion over 10 years, which, with the interest savings, is nearly $1 trillion in deficit and debt reduction. These are significant savings, Mr. President. And if we ask the wealthiest 2% of Americans to take on that burden, to go back to the interest rates on marginal income that they lived through in the Clinton era, what might that do? Significantly reduce our deficit and debt, make it possible for us to sustain the earned income tax cut, the tuition tax credit, and the child tax credit, and frankly, reflect our values. Mr. President, as I said before, this recession has brought an alarming rise in the rate of poverty. I'm someone who believes that our faith traditions, and we come from a very broad range of faith traditions, speak to us and challenge us to show our values in our budget. As the Vice President who held the seat that I hold in Delaware before me has so often said, his father and his grandfather once said to him, "Show me your budget, and I'll show you your values." Psalm 72 teaches us that to defend the cause of the poor and to give deliverance to the needy is one of our highest callings, a call that is repeated throughout books of the Torah and the New Testament in many faith traditions across this country. To reject this deliverance to the needy, to reject the great tradition of a circle of protection, of a prayerful reflection on those who are the neediest in our society, and instead say we will extend ad infinitum the tax rate breaks for the wealthiest Americans, I think defies America's values and defies our greatest tradition of creating and sustaining opportunity while protecting the most vulnerable amongst us. I think, Mr. President, that our belief in the American dream and our commitment to basic fairness and responsible problem solving calls us forward to vote for the Reid plan today. This bill is not a substitute for the comprehensive tax reform our nation truly needs, tax reform that simplifies the code, that closes many unsustainable and costly loopholes while lowering rates and broadening the base. No, that's a task to which we must turn at another time. But in the current political environment, Mr. President, I believe this bill, to which I hope this body will turn, is the best chance we've got at retaining these important tax credits and opportunities for the working poor while bringing some sanity to the rates at the highest end and asking those who have benefited the most to contribute to solving our problems. Last week, I got a letter from Judith in Tallyville, Delaware, who wrote my office to say, and I quote, "Millionaires and billionaires must be asked to pay their fair share to sustain our economic recovery." Mr. President, Judith puts her finger on the crux of this issue. If we're going to solve our deficit issue, if we're going to resolve the hole at the bottom of America's balance sheet, and in a way that reflects our core values, I think we must move to, we must consider, and we must pass the Reid Plan in this Senate this day. Thank you.
President.
Yeah.
Mr. President, today we are debating the proposal of the Senate Democratic leadership to raise taxes on the American people. Pursuit of this tax hike strategy is clearly being instigated by the President's re-election efforts. I suspect that many of my friends on the other side of the aisle are very uncomfortable with this strategy. I can think of a number of Senate Democrats whose constituents would be surprised to learn their senator supports tax increases on small businesses, an increase in the AMT, the alternative minimum tax, and hikes in the death tax. With the economy still on the ropes, I think they would be surprised to learn their senators supported a tax hike strategy that might win some votes, but at the risk of sparking a recession. That is what the President wants. We will see if that is what he gets. He has pitched his tax hike plan as a way to be fiscally responsible. That could not be further from the truth. One need only look at my friends on the other side's treatment of the House budget. That budget received more votes than any other budget considered by the Senate, including the phantom budget advanced by the Senate Democratic caucus. The House budget provided $180 billion more in deficit reduction than the President's budget for 2013. The House budget's extra deficit reduction of $180 billion exceeds the differences in deficit impact between the proposal I introduced with my friend and colleague, the Republican leader, and the proposal advanced by my Democratic friends. And that's true even if you apply the other side's distorted and misleading accounting of the differences between the two proposals. More on that in a moment. So when we hear our friends on the other side say that they must risk going off the fiscal cliff for deficit reduction, consider this. They rejected out of hand spending restraints that provided more deficit reduction than is at stake here today. Not only are the deficit reduction numbers phony, but the President and his Democratic allies in the Senate have repeatedly suggested that they are willing to intentionally drive our economy off what the Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke has called the fiscal cliff in order to make a political argument about the top marginal tax rates. The President thinks he has struck political gold with this argument. He will be able to run for re-election on a platform of raising taxes under the mantle of deficit reduction. Now, this might be politically advantageous, but I doubt it. But I do know that from a fiscal and economic perspective, the President's signature proposal threatens serious damage to our already fragile economy. The President's tax increases on those he deems the rich, in fact, represent a massive tax hike on the small businesses that are necessary for economic and job growth. Moreover, until he gets his way on raising taxes on these small businesses, he is threatening every single American taxpayer with a tax hike. Like a petulant child, he is insisting that it is his way or the highway. We've had far too much of that. He'll get his way on raising taxes on the small businessmen and entrepreneurs who find no shelter in today's Democratic coalition of unions, lawyers, and government employees, or he will let the current tax relief expire, raising taxes on all Americans. Now, this is the antithesis of statesmanship at a time when our economy requires serious direction. It is the political equivalent of a temper tantrum. And I expect that American voters will have about as much patience for this as they would a similar fit from their children. The American people want a grown-up in the White House, but on tax policy, we appear to be dealing with adolescents. I've said before that the President's proposal is the policy equivalent of Thelma and Louise intentionally driving their convertible off the cliff. The difference is that there is at least some ambiguity left about the fate of Thelma and Louise. If the President gets his way and either raises taxes on small businesses or denies relief to all American taxpayers, there will be no ambiguity about who to hold responsible when our economy crashes. When a liberal Democratic president has lost the New York Times, he has lost America. And even the Times understands what is coming if the President continues to put the pedal to the floor and drive us over the fiscal cliff. The Times wrote that with the economy having slowed in recent weeks, business leaders and policymakers are growing concerned that the tax increases and government spending cuts set to take effect at year's end have already begun to cause companies to hold back on hiring and investments. That is 100% right. The election is not for another 3 months, and already the President's lack of direction and the threats emanating from Democratic leadership about letting the tax relief expire are leading businesses to slow down. How can businesses plan for next year? How can they make hiring or investment decisions when they have no idea what their tax rates are going to be? They simply can't. And the President and Senate Democratic leadership, with their delay and confusion about how to extend this tax relief, are doing absolutely nothing to inspire confidence in these job creators. Rather than address the expiration of the 2001 and 2003 bipartisan tax relief, we have been debating campaign commercials masquerading as serious legislation. Last week, the Senate wasted its time on yet another piece of legislation that had absolutely no chance of becoming law and zero prospects for creating jobs. It is worth comparing the puny impact of the bill considered last week to the size of the coming tax hikes. Tax hikes so large that the Washington Post has referred to their impending arrival as Taxmageddon. Take a look at this impact of 20% tax credit versus Taxmageddon over the next 10 years. If we bring jobs, the Bring Jobs Home Act would only cost about $87 billion. Taxmageddon is going to cost us $4,538 billion. Make no mistake, our small businesses and our economy face an existential threat at the end of 2012. Yet the majority leader schedules votes that generate campaign fodder rather than jobs or lasting economic growth. Facing a fragile economy and a weak jobs market, President Obama seems content to sit idly by and allow the scheduled $4.5 trillion tax hike to occur just to make a populist political argument about the need for the so-called rich to pay what he thinks is their fair share. Mr. President, Congress needs to act now in order to prevent this tax hike on America's families, individuals, and job creators. Just look at this chart. Look at the difference between Bring the Jobs Home Act and Taxmageddon. It's pretty clear they're just driving us off the cliff. And they're willing to do it for political reasons. It's critically important for our economy and the American people that we act now to extend the bipartisan tax relief originally signed into law by President Bush and extended by President Obama back in 2010. As you can see, the tax legislation to-do list, nothing done on tax extenders, although we're willing to work on that with our committee chairman in the Finance Committee. Nothing done on the AMT patch. We're willing to work on that in the overall scope of things. Nothing done on death tax reform. In fact, the suggestion by the Democrats is to increase it so that all the small farms in this country, or many of them, are going to get hammered with taxes. A lot of small businesses will be hammered with taxes. Nothing done to prevent the 2013 tax hikes. No, 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 no on everything. This is the most crucial piece of legislation Congress can address this year. If we allow this tax relief to expire as scheduled, almost every federal income taxpayer in America will see an increase in their rates. And yet that's what our friends on the other side said they're going to do if they don't get their way like petulant children. Some will see a rate increase of 9%. Others will see a rate increase of as much as 87%. Because the vast majority of small businesses are flow-through business entities, any increase in tax rates for individuals necessarily means that these small businesses will get hit with a tax increase. This tax increase lands on these small business owners even if they do not take 1 penny out of their business. That's what the Democrats are going to do to them. They're willing to go over the cliff and do this? Our economy simply cannot afford to take on such a fiscal shock. It was just in 2010 where the President said the economy was so fragile we needed to carry over the 01-03 tax cuts. We're in worse shape today than we were in 2010, but unfortunately unfortunately or fortunately, we're in an election year, but unfortunately the President's playing games with these very serious matters. Now, our economy simply cannot afford to take on such a fiscal shock. Economists estimate that if these current tax rates are allowed to expire, the economy could contract by approximately 3 percentage points. Now, considering that the first quarter GDP growth was 1.9% and that expectations are even lower for the second quarter growth that will be reported this Friday, going over the fiscal cliff will almost certainly throw us into a recession. And I don't know many economists who would disagree with that. Certainly the Fed doesn't disagree. We're going to go into a recession if the Democrats get their way. We could even slip into recession in the second half of this year, given businesses' reluctance to hire and invest due to fiscal uncertainty. For the President and others who argue that we should raise the top 2 tax rates in the name of fiscal responsibility, I would just like to point out a few things. The Senate Majority Leader introduced his tax bill, one that largely mirrors the President's proposal, under the auspices of deficit reduction. It closely adheres to the Democratic talking point that the only thing standing between our deficits and fiscal stability is the current top marginal tax rates. We've heard this argument for a year and a half, with the President and his Democratic allies insisting that it is not their out-of-control spending that got us into this mess, but the Republicans' refusal to allow for tax hikes on the so-called rich. That's laughable. This argument sounds nice, but it's belied by the actual facts. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, an apples-to-apples comparison of the Democrats' tax proposal and the proposal I introduced with my friend, the Republican leader, shows a difference of $54.5 billion. The Democrats' bill, which raises the top rates and expands the death tax while patching the AMT for 1 year, is scored at $249.7 billion. And the score of my bill, without the 2013 AMT patch, is $304.2 billion. So we have a debt that is fast approaching $16 trillion. Taxes are set to go up by $4.5 trillion. And Senate Democrats are crowing about their fiscal responsibility, threatening to drive the economy off the cliff over $54.5 billion of tax relief. I believe this is called missing the forest for the trees. In order to satisfy their urge to redistribute $54 billion of taxpayer dollars, they are willing to risk a recession and see taxes go up by $4.5 trillion? The President recently claimed that we need to raise the top two tax rates because, quote, it's a major driver of our deficits, unquote. The numbers show that this is plain and simple nonsense. The real difference between the Democratic and Republican plans is only $54.5 billion, or about 5% of the deficit. That represents 34% of our national debt. To put it another way, the Democrats' tax hike proposal would only provide enough additional revenue to pay for 5 days of federal government spending. 5 days of federal government spending. It is also worth noting that what exactly the Democrats' refusal to provide 2 years of AMT relief means for their constituents. If Senate Democrats do not patch the AMT in 2013, their AMT will take away over 40% of the tax relief they claim to be providing with their bill. Now, this is their prerogative, but I hope that the hometown papers in Northern Virginia, New Jersey, New York, Florida, and Colorado are paying attention. I hope they're paying close attention to what a lack of AMT relief will mean for middle-income families in those states. Now, these tax proposals in the end have nothing to do with sound tax policy that maximizes economic growth. And they have nothing to do with deficit reduction. They have everything to do with pursuing an antique economic philosophy that is principally concerned with running down the economy's job creators and entrepreneurs. And the explicit tax policy is only the half of it. We learned yesterday from the Congressional Budget Office that the true tax bill for Obamacare is over $1 trillion. We were promised there wouldn't be any tax increases. It is the biggest fiasco that I've seen around here almost in the whole time I've been here. I can't think of anything bigger. All of the new Obamacare regulations will cost McDonald's franchises alone more than $400 million in health care costs. The President might think that Ray Kroc did not build McDonald's, but this is delusional. He might view the small businessman who took a chance and opened those franchises as not especially smart, not responsible for their own success. But this is a view that could only be embraced by an academic and activist who has no experience in the private sector. The Joint Committee on Taxation tells us that 53% of all flow-through business income in the United States would be subject to the President's proposed tax hikes. Take that, small business, the President is saying. We don't really care about you, I guess. Well, I do. And Republicans certainly do. The President's proposal would take the marginal tax rate on small businesses from 33% and 35% to 39.6% and 41% respectively. Look at this. This is the increase in small business, the top marginal rate. As you can see, it goes up from 33 and 35 to 40, 41%. How could that not help but ruin our economy? This is the kind of economic thinking that we're putting up with around here. And it's all coming from the White House. And our friends on the other side apparently don't want to take the White House on. It's an increase of 17 to 24% on the marginal tax rates for small businesses. Ernst & Young recently released a study showing that these proposed tax hikes, on top of Obamacare's 3.8% tax increase on dividends, interest, and capital gains, would reduce our economic output by 1.3%. The Ernst & Young study also found that real after-tax wages would fall by 1.8% as a result of President Obama's policies. Not surprisingly, the study noted that 54% of the entire private sector workforce is employed by flow-through businesses such as S corporations and partnerships, the majority of which would see their taxes go up under the President's plan. That's where the jobs are. What kind of thinking are they willing to accept on the other side of the aisle? It's hard for me to believe. There's a person over there I don't care for. It's hard for me to believe that they aren't willing to stand up to this president and say, hey, the game's over. The truth is, many of the people targeted by Democrats as wealthy are in fact middle-income small business owners who spend their whole lives building a business and then sell it, getting thrown into a top bracket just for the year of sale. Consider a real-life example provided by the Associated Builders and Contractors. A husband and a wife from Pennsylvania who retired to Florida owned an S corporation. In 2009, the couple paid no federal income tax because they did not have enough taxable income to owe any tax. In 2010, when they sold the business, their adjusted gross income was about $780,000, and they paid $170,000 in taxes. If they had not sold their business in 2010, they would have paid no taxes. So the one-time sale of the business built up over many years caused these small business owners to be in one of the two top brackets for just 1 year after years of building their business. And then having to sell it, have this catastrophe fall on them. Yet the President would have the American people believe that this couple was part of some rich elite that is refusing to pay its fair share. And that's not all. Or as Ron Popeil would say, but wait, there's more. Last week, before the ink was even dry on the Democratic leader's small business tax hike legislation, the bill was changed to substantially increase, get this, substantially increase the death tax. Now, why was that? Because we found there was only $28 billion difference between the Democrat bill and our bill. And they wanted to find a way of getting it up to $50 billion, which is, like you say, 5 days of spending around here. Now, it might be hard to believe, but this proposal is even worse than President Obama's. The proposal by the Democratic leader would impose the death tax on 15 times the number of estates than under current tax policy, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation. It would increase the number of estates hit by the death tax from 3,600 estates to 55,200. According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, 24 times more farming estates would be hit by the Democrats' death tax proposal. What's going on over there? These are intelligent people, our friends on the other side. How can they possibly live with this? According to the Joint Committee on Taxation, 24 times more farming estates would be hit by the Democrats' death tax proposal that they wrote in here. Now, I have to believe they just did it so they could raise the difference between the two bills from $28 billion, 3 days spending by the federal government, to a little over $50 billion, 5 days spending. Let's call it 8 days spending. And the number of small businesses hit by this death tax spike would grow by 13 times. What would that do to the incentives for people to build small businesses? Small businesses that could become big businesses and employ thousands of people. Now, this proposal would subject 2,400% more farms and 1,300% more small businesses to the death tax. Farmers work all their lives hoping they can leave their farm to their children. They'll have to sell the farm to be able to pay the death taxes that our friends on the other side have written into this bill. They can't be serious, but they are. I would like to be a fly on the wall when some members of this body go home and attempt to defend their support for a proposal effectively designed to hobble small businesses and family farms. The President might think it is no big deal. I'm not sure he's ever been on a farm other than since he's been president. And I'm not sure he's ever worked with a small business. He's been a community organizer. That's important. That doesn't necessarily qualify you for president. After all, according to the president, those farmers and businessmen really were not responsible for their success anyway. Now, I'm going to give the president the benefit of the doubt on that one. I think he maybe misspoke. But I sometimes think that he thinks these folks aren't very smart, at least in the president's view. They really owe it all to the bureaucrats stationed at the Departments of Agriculture and Labor and their helpful investment-creating regulations. Well, we all know about those, don't we? The sweat and tears and sacrifice of the families and individuals who create and run small businesses have nothing on the hard work and commitment of the mid-level bureaucrats who make their success possible. Now, my guess is that some members of this body have a slightly more nuanced understanding of the importance of these farms and businesses to their communities on both sides of the aisle. They have to. There's a limit to what this president should ask of my Democrat friends. And he's asking way too much. And they should stand up and say, we've had it. We're not going to do this. Madam President, it seems clear what the agenda of the Senate should be. We should be focused like hawks on preventing tax-mageddon. We should be focused on job creation. Yet instead of addressing these important matters, President Obama and his Democrat allies are spinning their wheels trying to raise taxes on politically unpopular groups. Even the Democrats' treasured Keynesian economics says that you do not raise taxes in a weak economy if you want to create more jobs. The president is devoting his entire re-election campaign toward tax hiking in the name of fairness. We have voted twice on proposals to raise taxes on oil and gas companies for no other reason than that Democratic pollsters found that the president's base does not like oil and gas companies. Then a few months ago, we voted on the silly Buffett rule. This was not serious tax policy. It was a statutory talking point, and not a very good one at that. And then there was last week's bill on overseas investment that was little more than a campaign advertisement with co-sponsors. The American people are tired of these political stunts. They're tired of the Senate doing nothing. They're tired of the Senate bringing up bills that aren't going to go anywhere. Every minute Democrats spend playing politics is a minute that we fail to prevent the largest tax increase in American history. But instead of working to prevent this massive tax hike on small businesses, the president and the congressional Democratic leadership have doubled down on their tax hike strategy. Believe it or not, while doubling down on their tax hike strategy, our friends on the other side are pushing the canard that the Hatch-McConnell proposal is a tax hike. Yesterday, one of our colleagues, who I won't name, though he named me, said the following, and I quote, "Republicans claim not to want to raise taxes, but the Republican tax bill would let very popular lower and middle class provisions expire that would cost 25 million Americans an average of $1,000 each. Under the Republican bill, 12 million families would see an end to the smaller child tax credit. 6 million families would lose their earned income tax credit, and 11 million families would lose their American Opportunity tax credit." Unquote. A little over 11 years ago, 1/4 of the Democratic caucus supported the bipartisan 2001 relief plan, which is the foundation of the policy underlying the Hatch-McConnell bill. At that time, the Joint Committee on Taxation showed that the bill distributed as an across-the-board tax cut, which made the tax code more progressive. The 2003 bill was passed on a narrower bipartisan basis and extended on a broader bipartisan basis in 2004 and 2006. Bipartisan. Joint Committee on Taxation data show that against current law, the fiscal cliff my friends are threatening is not surprisingly basically the same as it was in 2001, 2003, and 2006. In other words, the Hatch-McConnell proposal provides across-the-board tax relief benefiting virtually every income taxpayer, yielding a tax system that is more progressive than what we would face if we went over the fiscal cliff. Let me just repeat that again. The Hatch-McConnell proposal provides across-the-board tax relief benefiting virtually every income taxpayer, yielding a tax system that is more progressive than what we would face if we went over the fiscal cliff. The Joint Committee on Taxation analysis includes or indicates a similar result today. To be sure, if you count continuous stimulus checks issued by the government to folks that do not pay income tax as tax cuts, the Democrats' proposal does more of that than the Hatch-McConnell proposal. No question about that. But when is it going to end? When is the upper 49% all going to have to continue to just carry everything in this country? Under federal budget law, those continuous stimulus checks are counted in the main as spending. I would say to the colleague I referred to a moment ago that if the Democrats want to use that talking point, one at odds with conventional budget accounting, it's a free country. But if Democrats are going to make that strained and tortured charge, then they should also answer for the failure of their bill to patch the AMT for the year they claim to be delivering middle-income tax relief. Their plan exposes 28 million middle-income families to a tax stealth tax increase of over $3,500 per family. So while they claim that our bill raises taxes by cutting stimulus spending, they are mum on the massive tax increase on 28 million American families implicated in their own bill. I think we might have a case here of folks in glass houses throwing stones. And make no mistake, Madam President, Tax-Mageddon is coming. The only good news is that Congress can prevent this historic tax increase from happening. As I mentioned, I have a bill that I have introduced with Senator McConnell, S-3413, the Tax Hike Prevention Act of 2012, that will prevent this historic tax increase and will pave the way for tax reform in 2013. That is where my focus will be until Tax-Mageddon is averted, and I hope that my colleagues will join me in preventing this looming tax increase from being imposed on the American people. 40 of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle voted to temporarily extend this tax relief in 2010, recognizing that we were in financial difficulty. We're in worse difficulty today, and they should do so again. At that time, President Obama said that it would be foolish to raise taxes during an economic downturn, and he acted accordingly. And I respect him for that. But he's not acting that way now. This is an election year. Our economy remains weak today. In fact, it's weaker in terms of growth in GDP than it was at the end of 2010. And incoming data clearly point to even more slowing in the economy as uncertainty from the fiscal cliff has begun to strangle hiring and investment. My friends on the other side have got to wake up to these facts. The only thing that appears to have changed is that President Obama has apparently chosen the path of class warfare and is pursuing a politics-driven tax agenda. I remember days in the past where my friends on the other side would rise up against even their own president when it comes to good economics, and I hope they will again. But it appears like it's not so today. My hope is that my colleagues who have supported this tax relief in the past will put the president's short-sighted and self-interested partisanship aside and vote on behalf of their constituents in favor of S-3413 to extend this tax relief to America's families and small businesses. For the sake of the more than 12.7 million unemployed Americans. My hope is that we act to prevent the President's campaign drive to malign small businesses and raise their taxes, and that it does not get in the way of sound tax policy and job creation. To put us through this for a difference of a little more than $50 billion between the two bills is amazing to me. That amounts to, like I say, about 5 days of federal spending. And to just do this because the President wants it done? Sometimes it's really good for this body to stand up and say, Mr. President, you're going too far. Now, what have I proposed? I propose that we, since it's even worse than 2010 when the President thought it was the wise thing to do in a fragile economy, that we put over 01-03 tax cuts for 1 year. 1 year. And that we strike out a new force in this Senate and in the House to do tax reform in that year on a bipartisan basis. I don't think that's an unreasonable request, especially under the circumstances that we've seen with the potential of Tax-Mageddon. I actually believe that it would be very, very wise on the part of all senators in the Senate to do exactly that. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could work together for a change over the next year, knowing that that year is devoted to taxes and to tax reform? Let me just read a letter from the Associated Builders and Contractors, which I won't read it because I have it. I've been referring to it in my remarks today. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that a letter from the Associated Builders and Contractors dated July 25, 2012 be placed in the record at this point.
No objection.
I thank you, Madam President. Look, I yearn for the day when we can see both sides come together and work together. And work together in the best interest of the country. We know that this presidential election is close. We know that they're virtually in a tie right now. Let that play itself out, but let's do what is right here. Let's not hammer small business. Let's not have the biggest tax increase in history. Let's not put this country into a recession and maybe even a depression. It was irresponsible in my eyes for any Democrat or any Republican to say that if you don't give us what we want, we're going to just go into, we're going to allow Thelma and Louise to go off the cliff. And we're Thelma and Louise in this situation. We can stop that, prevent that, work together, and hopefully come up with an economic program that everybody in this body can support, or at least a vast majority can support in a bipartisan way. I hope we can get through this. I'm very, very concerned about our country. I'm very, very concerned about this election year, the way these type of things are being brought up. And let me just make one last comment. The Senate's not being run like a Senate. They're not going according to the regular order. We're not going through the committees. It's pure politics. And I expect a little bit of that, but I don't expect everything to be pure politics. Where our side isn't even given a chance under many circumstances to even bring up amendments in the greatest deliberative body in the world. You can see why there's some bad feelings around here. And it's all being done just to protect some members here rather than doing what's right for the economy and for our country. I think we've got to wake up and start doing things in a little better fashion around here. And I hope we can. I hope that my colleagues on the other side will accept my suggestion here. It's done in good faith. I believe we can dedicate next year to tax reform, and I believe we can get it done if we work together. I believe we can bring this country out of the morass that it's in. And I suspect that if my colleagues on the other side will support what I've suggested here today, the economy will start to turn around almost immediately. And it would be for their benefit, it seems to me, in this presidential election year. Even though I don't trust what some have done in the past. Madam President, I suggest the absence of a quorum, or I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Alaska.
Madam President, I have 10 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, I have prepared comments. I'm now probably going to deviate. I listened to my good friend, colleague, Senator Hatch from Utah. Respect him greatly, but I want to take note to some of his comments and just clarify a few things and also comment on this important piece of legislation that we have in front of us as one of, if not only, small business person in this body and chamber, actually runs a small business. Small business defined not by the SBA, which is 500 and below. I don't know about you, when I talk to small business people, they wish they had 500 employees. It'd be a dream, but it's not. That's not the fact. And we have to be careful with the numbers, and there's a lot of numbers thrown around, but let's be first clear. It was interesting, the story about the gentleman from Florida who sold his business and paid more taxes. Well, actually, probably my guess is, and I'll be corrected on the record if necessary, but when you sell your small business, you pay actually a capital gains tax, which is about 15%. So when you make more money when you sell your business, I've sold several of my small businesses over the years, and, you know, if you don't reinvest, you pay a certain rate, and when you reinvest, you can bypass it through an exchange and a variety of other opportunities that you're afforded through the tax code. And I know my friend from Utah knows that because he sits on the Finance Committee. But so I'm guessing that small business person actually had a pretty good rate, 15 points, which isn't bad. But let me also make sure it's very clear. Again, there's a lot of numbers thrown around. The bills are very simple. They both cost money. One costs $930 billion over the next 10 years. One costs $250 billion. The proposal that my friend from Utah suggested costs $930 billion over 10 years. That's how the Congressional Budget Office scores these things. You can argue if you agree or disagree. It's amazing to me, on days people like the numbers, they agree. On days they don't like the numbers, they disagree with the person. But the CBO is a CBO. I don't like the group, in a sense. I like the people, but I think they have some black magic box there. They come up with numbers. But the fact is, that's the numbers. That's the bipartisan organization that's selected by this body jointly to determine these numbers. And we can argue over them after the fact. For example, when this extension that my friend talks about over there, and just one more year, how many times have we heard it? I've heard it twice now since I've been here. It was a 10-year deal when it was first passed. That would bring this relief and this growth in this economy beyond our belief. Well, in the last 3.5 years, I don't know. The economy crashed. It's recovering now, struggling. When I came here, they said we need extended just for 2 years to help the economy. So we extended it. I voted to extend them all for 2 years. I'm not doing that again. We can't afford it. For 2 years, we had this extension, supposed to booming economy. Well, we've had a slow growth economy. But the people who are building this economy are the small business people. These are people who have 25 or less employees, real small business people. As a matter of fact, this bill, and I heard the number, and again, I ask people who listen to the numbers and the twisted commentary that everyone gives on both sides at times. I try to keep it simple. In Alaska, we just tell it like it is. Here it is. Here's the facts as we see them and we saw them in documents or whatever may be presented to us. 97% of the small businesses in this country will not see a tax increase. Will not see a tax increase, because they're real small business people. When we walk out of this building and we go down the street here for lunch and we see the restaurateurs that are operating, they're not 500 employees. They're 10 or 15. Or like Alaska Growth Company, Hugh Short I talked to today, he has 15 employees. The largest SBA lender in the state of Alaska, bigger than Wells Fargo, bigger than Key Bank, bigger than all of them, 15 employees. That's a small business. That's the people we're talking about. So when people sit down here and proclaim, and I, again, respect my friend, he's been a lawyer all his life. I'm not a lawyer, no disrespect to lawyers. I'm a small business person. That's where I made my living. That's where I make my living. That's where my family makes our living. So let's make sure it is clear what we are talking about. When he talked about, I can't remember the exact percentage, 54% of these dollars are passed through. Dollars he talked about. Yeah, because the 3% or the employers over 25 or 50 employees have huge revenue streams. But the small business people in this economy, 97% of them make less than $250,000 net income. That's what we're talking about. You know, I think every small business would love to have net income over $250,000. They strive for it every day. I know I do in my small business. I hope every day that we achieve these numbers. So don't, as the public listens carefully to the debate, and as the minority leader said earlier today, there is a difference, a clear difference. We cannot afford their bill. The taxpayers cannot afford their bill. $930 billion over the next 10 years plus interest costs. Everyone forget that? I've heard over and over again from the other side, 40% of what we borrow is, you know, we've got to borrow it to pay our bills. 40% of everything we pay, we got to borrow. Okay. Where are they getting the $930 billion? Where's that coming from? It costs money, costs interest. We don't have it. Because the last decade and a half of people and how they operated this body, Democrats, Republicans, spent like there was no tomorrow. Well, tomorrow is here. And we have to determine what our priorities are. My priorities, despite the fear tactics that are being laid out, I support small businesses, 100%. Many bills I presented and supported over the last 3.5 years about protecting and in growing our small business community and defined as real small business. People who have to take their credit cards and figure out how to get capital because banks won't give them the money, because they have a dream of an opportunity that people look at them and say, well, you know, how much money you got in our bank? Can you mortgage your 2 homes or 1 home, or can you put everything up that you have as collateral plus maybe your firstborn? I've been through this. You know, my wife started her small business with a small investment out of her retirement funds, her own funds, and a small $30,000 SBA loan, an SBA loan. And just a side note here, Madam President, I get so frustrated when I hear these, you know, these ads. Everyone's going to exaggerate what they hear and see, what people, I'm sure whatever I say today, in 2 years from now, they'll take a couple words and use them against me. I expect that. They'll make it up. They'll say whatever they want. That's what they do. That's what opponents do in campaigns. It's too bad. We can't talk about the issues. But, you know, I'm not here to defend the president. The president gets to defend himself. That's what he does. I've disagreed with the president more than once. I've disagreed with my national party more than once. But his point was, when you build a business, there's other elements that help you build it. My wife's business, SBA loan. You know, my business, I had a vending business. When I had those trucks on the street, those roads were built by a collective group of taxpayers that helped pay for those roads. It's a combination of things. But don't get me wrong. It is the blood, sweat, and tears of small businesses, the people who come up with the dreams and the ideas that create these businesses and push it forward. So I sat here patiently. I listened as I was presiding, now here. The numbers are simple. One costs more, one costs less. Taxpayers can't afford it. 2 years ago, like I said, I supported the extension because I was told that We're going to invest. We're going to grow this economy significantly. Well, we've grown it on the backs of small business people. That's who we've grown this economy with. That's where the fastest growing population of new employees are coming from. So to my friends on the other side, we gave that idea a shot. It didn't really perform. And I have to say that Thelma and Louise, scene that I hear all the time, thank God they were driving an American car. Because my bet is they landed safely on the other side wherever they went. But the fact is, it was in this body, and I heard the same arguments on the other side. We can't help our auto industry. We can't help them out of what they're struggling with. Well, we took a risk, calculated risk, to support those businesses that manufacture and employ people, and today they're thriving because this body said we're going to take a risk. So again, Thelma and Louise, thank you for driving an American car. Madam President, this is simple. It is about making sure 98% of Americans today continue to have tax relief. It's about 97% of the businesses continuing to have tax relief, small businesses. It's important that we do this not only for the economy, but for these families that are struggling. 300,000 families in Alaska alone will benefit from this relief. You know, there's a comment, you know, and I think Senator Lieberman said it earlier, and I recognize his point. His point is we should have real tax reform, and I agree. That's why I've sponsored a bill with Senator Wyden and Senator Coates on real tax reform. And we're moving down the path, but we've got to keep doing some things here, some things that keep this economy moving forward in the right direction. A typical family of four in Alaska, if not without this relief, will pay another $2,200 a year in taxes. A married couple of $80,000 with one teenager at home and another in college will see their taxes go up by $2,250. A couple earning $130,000 with one child will see their taxes go up by $4,000. I can go on and on with these examples. The point is we have some choices to make, and they're not going to be fun. You know, those days are gone. They did that the last decade and a half when they had money to spend and do all kinds of stuff. But we are now in a different situation. We have to make choices of who we invest in to grow this economy. And I'm going to invest in the small business community, the 97% that will continue to receive tax relief under this bill. The 98% of middle America that is working every day to try to make ends meet. These are the folks that I'm focused on. And I recognize my colleagues on their side want to, again, see massive tax reform. We haven't had it since the early 80s. I haven't been here since then. I know a lot of these guys have been here for a long time, sitting on Finance Committee and others. Well, do it. I'm all game. And for amendments on the floor, I'm all game for that. We did on the Farm Bill. We had, I don't know how many, 80 amendments. The Transportation Bill, we had a ton of amendments. Doesn't bother me one darn bit. Vote on whatever we need to vote on and move this economy forward and keep moving forward on the legislation that's critical. Let me end on one point, Madam President, and I respect my colleagues on the other side, and we agree many times, and sometimes we disagree. Today we disagree on this issue, because this is a fundamental. We don't have the money. We have to limit our abilities of where we can put our resources and target them in the best way we can. As I said, I voted a couple years ago for this extension on everything, and more layoffs occurred in these big companies, and certain things happened that didn't really show the economy growth. But one thing did happen. Small businesses did grow. Home prices for the first time in 5 years, reported last week, are up. New home starts are up for the first time in many months. Why are those up? Because the small business community and the middle America is starting to put money into those areas. That's important because that will grow this economy, grow it beyond our beliefs over the next decade plus. But for us to say we can still have the train moving at the speed we were moving at before the crash, we can't do it. We can't extend these tax rates for everyone. Everyone has to give a little. So we're asking the top 2% to give a little bit. At the end of the year, my guess is we're not going to extend the payroll tax. Can't afford it. So that means people on the other end will have to give a little bit. As my friend Senator Lieberman said, everyone needs to give a little bit. Yes, we're going to do that. So from my end, I see the give and take that's necessary. Tough decisions, but that's what we got elected for. That's why we're here. And just to keep business as usual and say, oh, just one more year, and oh, yes, we'll do tax reform someday. The day is here. There's no tomorrow, and we have to make tough calls. So why not give the relief to the real 97% of small businesses, again defined as, and again, I have to clarify, Madam President, you know, I have a sub-S, I have an LLC. I know this, I understand this, and the one comment my friend said to it, even if the owner didn't take a dime, and I have a business like that, I didn't take a dime, my LLC made money, I pay not a corporate, but I pay a pass-through through me, because I get it through a sub-S. At the end of the day, it's a combination of corporations. So the point is, everyone needs to give a little to make it happen, make it work. And today we're asking one group to give a little, but making sure the bulk of our economy continues to move forward, making sure that the 300,000 Alaskans that I see on a regular basis still get the relief. For the small businesses that are really creating businesses, creating a dream where they have to put a max on their charge card to build their business because they can't get capital from the banks, or spending time cashing out their retirement because they believe in their dream that this might be their opportunity. These are the people I'm going to support. So again, Madam President, I appreciate the time. I wish we had more of, you know, what happens down here. We come down, we speak, we leave. We come down, we speak, we leave. There's no real give and take, and I wish my friend from Utah was here. It'd be a great conversation about the data he used, but it's a very simple point. One costs almost $1 trillion. One costs about $250 billion. We can afford the lower cost one, protects 98% of the business or the people of this country, giving them relief, and 97% of our small businesses. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Thank you, Madam President. I also like to thank the senator